Cashin Vane's boots pressed heavily into the damp earth of Vorthis as he moved through the dense jungle. The air here was thick with humidity, each breath a fight against the weight of the atmosphere. His mission had begun like so many others. A simple reconnaissance, a few scans, a couple of hours of wandering through unfamiliar terrain. But nothing on this hellish planet could ever be called simple. His ship had crashed days ago, not far from a strange yet beautiful mountain range. The wreckage was a mangled mess, but he had expected to be alone. The planet's history told stories of primitive tribes, dangerous beasts, and an unpredictable wilderness. But nothing could have prepared him for the strange noise he'd heard. The screams were raw, filled with an agony that vibrated through the still air of the jungle. Cashin's instincts kicked in. He'd heard screams before, both human and alien, but this one was different. It was primal, desperate, echoing through the trees in a way that made his blood run cold. Without hesitation, he adjusted his weapon on his back and followed the sound. The jungle around him was alive with movement. Shadows shifting, the call of distant creatures, and the hum of alien plants that seemed to pulse with a strange energy. He pushed through thick vines and sprawling branches, his survival training keeping his focus sharp. The scream came again, this time closer. Cashin's pace quickened, every step driven by a strange sense of urgency, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound seemed to guide him, pulling him deeper into the untamed wilderness. As he navigated through a dense thicket of underbrush, a clearing emerged ahead, bathed in the dim, filtered light of the planet's twin moons. He froze. Before him, on a makeshift wooden platform surrounded by a ring of fire, a young alien girl was bound and struggling. Her skin shimmered in hues of silver and deep blue, with intricate, glowing markings that ran down her arms and across her chest like veins of pure energy. The light from the fire flickered across her delicate features, twisted in pain, her eyes wide with terror. The beings tormenting her were unlike anything Cashin had ever seen. Tribal aliens, their skin dark and patterned with jagged tattoos, surrounded her. They were speaking in harsh, guttural tones, their voices filled with mockery and hate. One of them, a towering figure, stood at the edge of the platform, holding a long, sharp blade that gleamed under the firelight. The girl's cries cut through the air again, and Cashin felt a surge of anger and fear. Without thinking, he moved. He crouched low, his training taking over as he silently approached, keeping to the shadows. His rifle was slung across his back, but he needed to be closer. There was no time to waste. His hands found the combat knife sheathed on his leg, the weight of it familiar, comforting. He wasn't sure what drove him. Perhaps it was the way she had looked, her fear-soaked eyes locking onto his for a moment before the firelight overwhelmed her. Or perhaps it was the sheer cruelty of what was happening here. Cashin moved in fast, slamming into the nearest tribal alien before the rest could react. A bone-crunching fist collided with the side of the creature's head, knocking it to the ground in a heap. The others turned, drawing crude weapons from their sides, but Cashin was already on them, his movements fluid and deadly. He wasn't thinking, wasn't planning, he was simply reacting. His knife flashed in the firelight, cutting through the air with precision as he took down one after another, the sounds of their shocked grunts and the clash of metal filling the clearing. The leader of the group swung a large spear toward him, but Cashin was faster. He sidestepped, grabbing the spear mid-swing and using the momentum to flip the alien onto his back. In seconds, the tribal aliens were either unconscious or retreating into the jungle, their screams of fear echoing behind them. Cashin stood in the silence of the clearing, his chest heaving with exertion. Sweat trickled down his brow, his heart racing not just from the fight, but from the sight of the girl before him. She was still bound to the platform, her body trembling with both fear and exhaustion. Her glowing eyes were fixed on him, wide with disbelief and cautious hope. "Hey!" Cashin's voice came out in a rasp, raw from the fight and the dust that filled the air. He stepped forward, slowly, not wanting to startle her. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." Her eyes flickered from his face to the ground, where her captors had fallen, and back to him. She said nothing at first, but her trembling lips parted, as though trying to speak, though no words came out. The language of Vorthis was foreign to him, and though he had studied alien dialects in his years as a soldier, he had never encountered anything like this. Cashin knelt beside her, his fingers gently pulling at the thick vines that bound her wrists. She winced as the ropes dug into her skin, but the moment he freed her, she pulled her arms close to her chest, curling into herself like a frightened animal. "Easy," Cashin muttered, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "I won't hurt you." She was breathing heavily, but the terror in her eyes seemed to calm a little, replaced by something new. Confusion. Caution. Her gaze darted to the jungle, as if expecting someone, or something, to reappear. Cashin took a slow breath, glancing around, making sure there were no more surprises. He had no idea who these people were, but they weren't local to Vorthis. He had seen enough of the planet to know that most tribes were primitive, but none had ever been this cruel. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice quieter now. The girl's eyes flickered toward him again, and for the first time, she spoke, her voice soft but filled with a strange musical quality. "Sailorin." Her accent was unfamiliar, melodic even, but there was an undeniable strength behind the syllables. Cashin nodded, his heart racing once again. "Sailorin. I'm Cashin." He let the moment linger, hoping his presence was a comfort to her. Her gaze softened for just a moment, and Cashin allowed himself a faint smile, though it quickly faded when he realized just how vulnerable she was. He hadn't just saved her from those tribal monsters. He had pulled her into a world of even greater danger, a world that didn't care for the weak. Cashin quickly untied the rest of the ropes, and as Sailorin stood shakily, he noticed the way her body trembled, not just from the pain of her injuries, but from the fear that clung to her like a second skin. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice low. Sailorin nodded once, but she didn't move. Her eyes scanned the jungle again, her body tensed, as if expecting the worst. Cashin reached out, offering his hand. She hesitated for a moment, before finally taking it, her skin cool and smooth under his rough fingers. They stood together, the firelight casting long shadows across the jungle, and for a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the distant calls of alien creatures and the rustle of the wind through the leaves. Cashin didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't know where they'd go, or even if she could trust him. But for the first time since his ship had crashed, he didn't feel completely alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Cashin led Sailorin through the thick underbrush, the weight of their surroundings pressing down on him. The jungle was alive, buzzing with the calls of unseen creatures, but the silence between them felt heavier than any noise could have. He could feel her eyes on him, a mix of wariness and something he couldn't quite place, something unspoken, almost tender. The moment he had freed her from her bonds, the world around them had shifted. It was no longer just about survival. It was about trust. He hadn't expected to feel this connection. There had been missions before, times when he had saved lives, but never had he felt this pull. Sailorin wasn't just another survivor in the field. She was something more, something fragile and strong at the same time. She walked quietly beside him, her steps cautious, as though each one was carefully measured. Cashin kept a slow pace, his senses alert for any signs of danger. He had no idea how far Drexith's tribe might be, but he didn't plan on taking any chances. He knew that if they were to survive this, they would need to move quickly, but more than that, they needed to trust each other. "Not much farther," he murmured, breaking the silence. His voice sounded raw, a reminder of the battle just hours ago. "I've got a place nearby, shelter." Sailorin's head snapped up at the word, her eyes wide. She spoke softly, the melody of her voice barely audible beneath the dense hum of the jungle. "Shelter," Cashin nodded. "A small camp, just a place to rest." She didn't respond, but he could see the wariness in her eyes as she glanced around, scanning their surroundings. It wasn't that she was afraid of him, he could sense that much. It was something deeper, something primal. She was afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of being caught again. They traveled in silence for another hour, Cashin staying alert to every rustle of leaves, every faint whisper in the wind. The jungle felt alive with secrets, its dense trees and thick foliage hiding dangers he couldn't see. Eventually, they came to a small clearing, surrounded by thick vines and the shadows of towering trees. Cashin stopped, nodding toward a small structure made of woven branches and leaves. It was simple but sturdy enough to protect them from the elements. He had found it months ago, during a reconnaissance mission, and had modified it into a temporary shelter. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them safe for now. He stepped inside first, motioning for Sailorin to follow. She hesitated at the entrance, her eyes darting to the shadows beyond the clearing, as if the forest itself were closing in on them. Cashin could feel the unease radiating from her, a quiet tension that seemed to hold her back. "It's safe," he assured her, though his own voice didn't carry the certainty he wanted. "No one's going to find us here." She finally stepped inside, her movements slow but deliberate, as if she were testing the ground beneath her feet. She looked around, her eyes scanning the humble shelter. The place was sparse, just a makeshift bedroll, a small campfire in the center, and a few scattered supplies he'd scavenged during his time on Vorthis. But for now it would do. Once inside, Cashin moved toward the fire, kneeling down to stoke it back to life. The flames crackled, sending a warm glow across the shelter. He could feel Sailorin's gaze on him, her presence quiet but intense. He met her eyes, his voice softer now. "You need to rest. You've been through hell." She looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. There was something in her eyes, an intensity, a deep sadness, that he couldn't ignore. "I can't," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know what will happen if I stop moving." Cashin frowned, the weight of her words settling in. He didn't know the full story yet, didn't know who Sailorin was, or what she had gone through to end up in that clearing, but he could sense the depth of her fear. This wasn't just about being chased by Drexitha's tribe. This was something more. "You've been through a lot," Cashin said, his voice low, "but you need to rest. We won't be able to outrun everything forever." She shook her head, her eyes distant. "You don't understand. If I rest, if I stop." Cashin rose from the fire, his movements steady and deliberate as he walked toward her. He didn't know what had happened to her before she was captured, but he could feel the strain in her voice, the weight of her words. "You're not alone anymore," he said softly, his gaze steady on hers. "I'm here." She didn't respond at first, her eyes locked on his, searching for something. Reassurance, perhaps, or just a sign that he wasn't like the others who had harmed her. Finally, after a long silence, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why?" The question hung in the air, simple but heavy. "Why are you helping me?" Cashin paused, his brow furrowing. The answer wasn't easy, but it was the truth. "Because it's the right thing to do." Sailorin blinked, her gaze flickering away from him for a moment before settling back on his face. The intensity in her eyes softened slightly, though the uncertainty remained. "Your people, they are not like mine," she said, her voice tentative, as though she were weighing every word. "Why do you care?" Cashin didn't know how to answer that question, not really. He didn't have an explanation that made sense. Maybe it was because she reminded him of something long lost, something pure, something worth protecting. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in a long time, he felt needed. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Maybe it's because you remind me of something I almost forgot." Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to find the truth in his words. She didn't speak again, but Cashin could feel the shift between them. The barrier that had existed since he'd pulled her from the platform seemed to ease, if only just a little. She sat down slowly, her body stiff, as though every motion was painful. Cashin took a deep breath and moved to gather some of the remaining supplies. Bandages, a medkit he had scavenged from his ship. The last thing they needed was for her injuries to get worse. As he worked, the fire crackled between them, the warmth casting shadows on the walls of the shelter. Sailorin watched him, her eyes softening with an emotion Cashin couldn't name. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that, maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely lost. The days following their quiet refuge were a blur of movement and tension, each hour stretching into the next as they journeyed deeper into the wilds of Vorthis. Cashin had become accustomed to the unease that clung to their every step. Sailorin's quiet vigilance, her reluctance to rest, the way her eyes always darted to the shadows, expecting danger. He understood. She had survived so much already. Trust wasn't something that could be easily given. But every day, she seemed to grow a little more comfortable with him, a little more willing to let down the walls she'd built around herself. It was late one afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in deep oranges and purples, that they realized they were not alone. Cashin had been scanning the horizon through the trees, his hand resting on the grip of his sidearm, when he felt it. A ripple in the air, a presence, something that tugged at his instincts. He froze. Sailorin, who had been walking beside him, stopped too. Her posture stiffened, the faint glow of her markings flaring briefly, as if in response to the threat she sensed. "They've found us," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like the wind itself might steal her words. Cashin didn't need any more confirmation. The pounding of heavy feet on the jungle floor, the rustling of leaves. It was unmistakable. Drexitha's warriors were close. Their scent, their presence, unmistakable. Cashin cursed under his breath. He had hoped they would have been able to move further, to stay hidden for a while longer, but it seemed their luck had run out. "We need to move," Cashin muttered, his voice low and urgent. Sailorin nodded without hesitation. She was already turning, her movements graceful despite the exhaustion that still weighed her down. Cashin moved in the opposite direction, pulling her with him. The jungle here was dense, its thick vines and towering trees offering some cover, but it wouldn't be enough to protect them for long. They ran, their footsteps light but hurried, the sound of their pursuit echoing through the dense underbrush. Cashin's mind raced. They were too close to the heart of Drexitha's territory. If they didn't get out of here, they'd be caught, no doubt about it. For a while, they managed to stay ahead of their pursuers, weaving through the undergrowth, keeping to the shadows. But just as Cashin thought they might make it, he heard the unmistakable sound of a whip cracking through the air. "Sailorin!" Cashin shouted, just as a coil of energy-wrapped wire shot through the trees and ensnared her leg. She cried out, the force of the impact sending her crashing to the ground, her body jerking painfully as the wire constricted. Cashin turned, heart hammering, but before he could reach her, a group of Drexitha's warriors emerged from the underbrush, surrounding them. Their faces were twisted in cruel grins, their eyes glowing with an eerie light as they advanced, weapons drawn. "Thought you could run, little girl?" One of them sneered, his voice grating like rocks scraping together. "Drexith will enjoy this." Cashin's pulse spiked, every muscle in his body screaming for action. He was outnumbered, but not outmatched. He was no stranger to fighting, to surviving against impossible odds. But this time it was different. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her. "Stay down," he ordered Sailorin, his voice harsh as he drew his knife. "I'll get you out of here." She looked up at him, her expression a mix of fear and defiance. "No, I will fight." "No," Cashin snapped. "You're in no condition." But before he could finish, Sailorin's eyes flared with a sudden, dangerous light. Her markings pulsed brighter, and she sprang to her feet with a fluidity that belied her injuries. The wire that had bound her legs snapped like a twig as she willed it to break, her strength coursing through her body with a surprising intensity. She moved with a grace that left Cashin stunned, her hands raised, and before he could react, she sent a burst of energy toward the nearest warrior. The impact was like a small explosion, sending the alien flying backward, his body crashing into the trees with a sickening thud. Cashin's heart skipped a beat. He had seen power before, but nothing like this. Sailorin was no ordinary alien. She wasn't just a victim of the tribal raids. She was a force, a survivor in her own right. But even her power wasn't enough to keep them safe for long. More of Drexitha's warriors advanced, now in full battle formation. Cashin fought his way through the ranks, his knife flashing through the air, cutting down the first few, but the odds were against them. The jungle seemed to close in, and the noise of battle was overwhelming. The energy in the air crackled with tension, the electric hum of Sailorin's power mixing with the savage grunts of their enemies. Just when it seemed like they might be overwhelmed, a massive roar echoed through the jungle, so loud it shook the ground beneath their feet. The warriors faltered for a moment, confusion spreading through their ranks. Cashin turned toward the sound, heart racing, and saw the massive form of a beast charging through the trees. It was an enormous creature, with armored plating covering its back and claws the size of daggers. It barreled into Drexitha's warriors with a terrifying force, scattering them like ragdolls. Sailorin stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She was clearly drained, her power spent. But the moment the beast appeared, she seemed to snap back into focus, as though she had regained some strength. She looked at Cashin, her expression tense but resolute. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Cashin didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm and pulled her along, his heart hammering in his chest as the jungle around them seemed to pulse with the violence of the battle. The beast fought valiantly, but it was clear that the warriors weren't backing down. Drexith wouldn't let them go easily. They ran, and for a moment, Cashin was lost in the chaos, but as the trees began to thin and the sound of the battle receded behind them, he found himself hoping that the distance they were putting between themselves and Drexith would be enough. He glanced at Sailorin, her face pale and streaked with dirt, but her eyes were still fierce. They had made it this far. They could make it further. But the world around them was far from kind, and every step they took into the unknown was one that brought them closer to whatever fate the stars had in store for them. The jungle's oppressive heat pressed down on them as they moved, but the immediate threat of Drexitha's warriors had subsided, at least for now. The distant sounds of battle had faded, and the ground beneath their feet had shifted from the dense, treacherous underbrush to a slightly clearer path. Cashin didn't slow his pace, though. They couldn't afford to rest. Not yet. The world around them still held dangers, both seen and unseen. Sailorin was struggling to keep up. Her strength was drained, her earlier burst of power leaving her fragile, her every step labored. Cashin glanced at her, feeling a deep ache in his chest. The girl had been through so much, and yet she still stood, still moved forward with determination. There was something raw and beautiful about her resilience, something that made him want to protect her at all costs. "Just a little further," he said, though his voice was more hopeful than certain. She nodded, but her pace slowed even more, her breath coming shallow and quick. Cashin was torn between pushing her forward and letting her rest. He knew that if they didn't find shelter soon, they'd be in danger again. But he couldn't ignore the fact that Sailorin was on the verge of collapse. "I need to stop," she whispered, her voice weak. "Just a moment." Cashin's heart clenched. He could feel the exhaustion in her words, the burden she carried. They couldn't afford to stop, not in this jungle where the very air seemed to carry danger. But as he looked at her, at the fear that lingered in her eyes, the vulnerability she tried so desperately to hide, he knew he had no choice. "All right," he said softly, his voice tender as he helped her lower herself to the ground. "Just for a little while." He set his pack down and knelt beside her, his fingers brushing against her arm as he checked her injuries. The bruises were still fresh, the cuts raw. Despite her resilience, she was not invincible. She was human in the truest sense, fragile, strong, and utterly beautiful. "We'll find a way out of this," he promised her, his voice steady, though he couldn't help the small doubt that crept into his mind. They were alone, outnumbered, and deep in enemy territory. And yet, something inside him believed that they could make it. Sailorin met his gaze, her eyes searching his, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something. But she didn't. She only nodded, and for the first time since they had met, she allowed herself to lean against him. Her head rested on his shoulder, her breathing slowing as she closed her eyes. Cashin didn't know how long they sat there. The jungle was quiet for a brief, fleeting moment, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The weight of the situation pressed down on him, but in this small, fragile moment of peace, he allowed himself to forget the threat, to forget the war that had brought them both to this point. He stayed there with her, the evening sky deepening into hues of indigo and violet above them, the air still but heavy. The quiet only lasted for so long before the jungle sounds returned, the distant calls of wildlife, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind. But it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the oppressive, dangerous silence that had once enveloped them, but the kind that came after the storm had passed. The kind that allowed for hope to grow. Cashin? Her voice was barely a whisper, but he heard it. It was the way her tone had changed, softer, almost vulnerable. "Yeah, I don't know where we're going," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know what will happen next." Cashin's chest tightened, his gaze meeting hers. He wasn't sure how to answer. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't know where the road ahead would lead them, or if they would ever be truly free of Drexitha's reach. But he knew one thing for certain. "We'll keep moving forward," he said quietly. "One step at a time." She held his gaze, and for a long moment, the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them, alone in the vastness of the jungle. Her eyes softened, and for the first time, Cashin saw something there. Something more than fear. There was trust. She reached up, her fingers brushing lightly against his, and for a second, neither of them moved. The connection between them was unspoken, but it was there. It was real. "I trust you," she whispered, and her voice was steady now, stronger than it had been in days. His heart thudded in his chest. The weight of her words settled deep inside him, filling the empty spaces he hadn't realized existed. Trust. The one thing neither of them had expected to find here, in the heart of danger. And yet it was there, in her eyes, in the way they were holding onto each other, as if their very survival depended on it. "I won't let you down," he promised, his voice low but certain. The moment lingered, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath again. The jungle around them felt like a faraway thing, as if it had retreated, leaving just the two of them in a bubble of time. For the first time in days, Cashin allowed himself to hope. He didn't know where they were headed, or what would come next. But whatever it was, they would face it together. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Cashin stood up, offering his hand to sail her in. She took it without hesitation, her fingers curling around his with a quiet strength. They moved forward, step by step, toward whatever awaited them in the unknown. The weight of their journey ahead heavy but bearable with each other by their side. And for the first time since he had crash-landed on this strange, hostile world, Cashin knew that they were not alone. They were together, and that was enough.